Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, 24 Hours of UX. So great to be here again. So, my name is Din. I'm Director of Growth from UX Philippines, a Filipino nonprofit organization since 2012. We've been organizing online and offline community events and conferences with a mission to build towards a more mature, collaborative, and design driven country. Representing the Philippines today is our speaker for the hour, UX Mark Lacsamana. So, Mark is a designer, advocate, and activist. He was previously working and leading design teams in Caliber and Grocery while advocating for inclusive design. He is also a queer activist and an advocate for active mobility. Also known as euthanasia in drag bars, Mark continues to push for more inclusive spaces. Currently, he's the lead designer for design systems at PageUp, and he'll be giving a talk on design in our post-colonial spaces. Here's Mark.
And hello, can can everyone hear me? Just asking if this is okay. Is the volume okay?
Yeah, volume's good.
Great. So welcome,
We can hear
guys.
you. Yep.
Welcome, guys. So let's begin. Before I start, I am going to give a brief warning that this talk may have instances that will make you feel uncomfortable. It will be political. We will start talking about race, colonialism, slavery, and I swear like a sailor, so there might be some profanity. So just be forewarned, and yes, happy Pride. So my name is Mark, and I wouldn't be in front of you now if wasn't a designer. So yes, I am a designer. However, besides that, I also come from this little country that I always say looks kind of like a turtle, but called the Philippines, which is a country in Southeast Asia. So, because a lot of you, and I'm specifically showcasing this because some people tend to forget, and it may be because I've been hanging out at TikTok way too long. Some people tend to forget that the Philippines is actually in Southeast Asia. But yes, and it's weird. Every time I say I'm from the Philippines, I always get comments from foreigners, mostly white folk, to ask me to talk to them about Jollibee, adobo, ube, Manny Pacquiao, or karaoke. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, I am not going to talk about Jollibee because I do not want to talk about a corporation, no matter how Filipino it is, that is transphobic and likes to fire transgender employees. I can't talk to you about adobo because my mom can't cook it and my grandmother never taught me how to cook it. I won't talk about Manny Pacquiao simply because I don't support homophobic boxers who are also politicians. And do not ask me to sing because I am the exception to the rule that Filipinos can sing. But I will give you a hot take on ube. It is not real ube unless it comes from a nun from a convent in a mountain province. With that, I will tell you what I will talk about, and I'm going to talk about stories, perceptions, narratives, and language. I'm going to talk to you about the stories and the history of my people and the place where I grew up. So, a long, long, long time ago, when the four nations lived in harmony, um, and well, majority of Southeast Asia was still a marinating region in the world. One of the first few peoples to ever come into the Philippines came on these giant boats called the Balangay. These giant boats became so important to their ethos that they eventually called their society or the villages that they would essentially establish in the Philippines. They would essentially call it the barangay, coming from the boat, Balangay. It is so important to their ethos that that's what they called it. It is so important to Philippine society, so much so that even to this day, in 2022, we still call the smallest local government unit, smaller than a city and smaller than a district, we still call it the barangay. In the barangay, basically pre-colonial Philippine society, in the barangay, you basically had four pillars of pre-colonial Philippine life, or four people that basically make up the pillars of the barangay. You had the chief, the warrior, the blacksmith, the priest, the chief, the warrior, the priest, and the blacksmith. In Filipino, these were called the datu, the mandirigma, the babaylan, and the panday. Before I go any further, feel free to say in the audience when you first saw that this was a chief, a warrior, a shaman, and a blacksmith. Feel free to tell me what, or at least feel free to picture in your head what do these people look like. Now that you're picturing it, how many of you saw a picture of a man when you saw these titles? So I'm not going to ask a show of hands, but it is highly likely when you saw chief, warrior, shaman, and blacksmith, the things that you saw were probably some D&D outfit of men in beards leading and owning these titles, which is unusual because in pre-colonial society, none of these were gendered roles. In the Philippines, there have been many women who became datus. In fact, in Makati City, one of our biggest business districts, there is a statue of Gabriela Silang, who is actually a female datu. Many of those female datus were also warriors. And the panday was never really the domain of men. It could have been anyone. Notice that I skipped over the shaman because I'm going to be focusing on the babaylan. The babaylan actually were never the domain of men or women, but in the Philippine sense or pre-colonial sense, they were the domain of a specific gender of people, what we call nowadays as transgender women. Many babaylan were actually transgender women who, according to Spanish text, when they first observed, these were men who lived and breathed their lives as women, who took in partners, basically acted like women. I make a joke that basically the babaylan and the panday were the queer people of the barangay, because you basically have your gay people and your lesbians, power tools. I'm joking. I know it's a bad joke, but yes. So this is the babaylan. The babaylan is actually a transgender woman who were always in high regard in Philippine society. They call them the katalonan, or the balyan, or the bayok in other parts of the country. They were transgender women. They were healers. They were witch doctors. They were shaman. They were people that people went to actually ask for when they should plant crops, when should they wage war, what do I do when my father is sick, etc. They were the wisest people in the village. But all of this changed when the white folk attacked, to be honest. In March 1521, Ferdinand Magellan came to the Philippines during his round the world voyage, and with him came Christianity. So the Spanish came and they really wanted to make use of the Philippines as one of their outposts because it was the gateway to the East. It basically made it easier to trade with China and the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, as they called it. In order to colonize the Philippines and subdue the people, they needed to take away everything that was already there, all the beliefs that were already there. In fact, one of the reasons why Magellan waged war with the locals was he found the locals still worshipping animist statues. Pre-colonial Philippines was mostly animist. Too bad for him, he died on the beaches of Mactan. And yes, but what ended up with this level or this pre-colonial violence against old beliefs stretched on for 300 years as the Spanish continued to colonize the entire islands. With that, they threw away all of the anitos. The anitos are basically are statuettes of our old gods. They banished all of the babaylan, pushed them away to the mountains, and they did flee. They hid in the mountains, trying to practice what they can until they were wiped out. Besides this, in order to stop people from actually worshiping or going to the babaylan, the Spanish created stories. And this is where we first hear of Filipino folklore monsters like the manananggal or the mangkukulam. The manananggal is a monster that appears through the night. During the morning, it looks like a woman. At night, it bisects its body from the waist down and spreads its wings to fly around the cities, looking for pregnant women that they could feast on their unborn young. While the mangkukulam is basically a witch who, if you wrong, would send out hexes in form of vengeance and witchcraft. From people who were regarded as the pillars of the community, as the wisest people in the community, who people turned to for healing and wisdom, the babaylan became the manananggal and the makongkulam. Through the stories that the Spaniards would tell and continue and which continued through in the local folk, we basically lost every single part of what made the babaylan special. The babaylan became from holy, the babaylan became demonic. Even in the words that we used, interestingly, the term bayok, which is the Visayan term for the babaylan, essentially became bayot. Bayot it's an awkward word where it both roughly translates to gay, but it can also roughly translate to a slur, similar to the F word. And this violence continues up to this day. Now, let me introduce to you this little girl named Dinah. Uh, Dinah, well, I heard of this girl named Dinah from a friend named Lester. And Lester was out in the in a province north of Manila, cycling around and looking for stories, when he chanced upon Dinah looking at his bike and was just wondering if she could ever ride it. Dinah is interesting because she is Filipino, but as you can see, she looks nothing like me. Dinah comes from the Aita tribe. The Aitas are actually a group of people who came way before even the people who came in from the Balangays. They are essentially the first inhabitants of these islands that I live on now. Dinah, who currently lives in a reservation in sitio, away from civilization, was just there wondering if she could ever get a bike because that would make her super happy. Because in the pandemic, basically people lost most of their travel, and the Aitas nowadays mostly rely on tourism to earn their keep. So the interesting part here is Dinah and her people lived in an area where now sits, well, in the 60s sat Clark Air Base. So when I told you about Spanish colonialism, that wasn't the end of colonialism in the Philippines. After 300 years, Spain would eventually sell the Philippines to the United States of America. The United States ended up using the Philippines as a protectorate, for around 50 years until World War II, when they finally gave independence. But that was not the end of it. Along with independence came understanding that the US would still have military bases in the Philippines. One of them was Clark Air Base. Clark Air Base is a military air base that was built on top of Aita's sacred ground. In order to build Clark Air Base, the Americans needed to push the Aitas out into the mountains where they now reside. Up to this day, many Aitas still live in poverty with a lack of education or access to health or basic necessities. What's even worse is because of the way the Aitas look, with their dark complexion and curly hair, they look basically nothing like most of the Filipinos you see. And because of the 300 years of European colonization plus 50 years of American imperialist colonization, many of the Filipinos, including myself, for a long time, had an issue with anti-blackness. Up to this day, we still have many skin bleaching products right in front of our grocery stores. And this level of anti-blackness actually affects the Aita, where people actually think of them as and dirty and uneducated, and it just perpetuates the violence towards them. This violence was not even started by the locals, but by Americans. In fact, when the Americans first came to the Philippines, they justified their they justified their imperialist push as white man's burden, saying that we should teach the Filipinos how to use soap so that they can clean using the Aitas as their backdrop. It's funny when we talk about white man's burden, because white man's burden is actually a poem. A poem made out of words strung together to emphasize and justify the annexation of the Philippines, specifically the Philippines. And they did this while designing a propaganda like the ones you see in front of you. And and this one right here, which whenever I see this, I find it super funny because not a single one of the Philippines, many native indigenous peoples looks like this. But this is how they justified and designed, using words and pictures and visual communication, their annexation of the Philippines. I'm gonna introduce to you one last person. This is Jennifer Laude. Jennifer Laude is a 26-year-old trans woman. In 2014, Jennifer Laude was last seen going into a motel. The next morning, she was found drowned. Sorry, I should have given a trigger warning for this. She was found drowned in the toilet of that hotel. Her killer is Lance Corporal Joseph Pemberton. Lance Corporal Joseph Pemberton is an American, what they call this, Marine, who was stationed in the Philippines not for Clark Air Base, because majority of the military bases in the Philippines have long been gone by the time this happened. But he was here for joint military exercises with the Philippines. So the interesting connection here is Jennifer Laude was found in a motel near Clark City, what was once Clark Air Base in Pampanga. In order to lessen his or mitigate his sentence, Joseph Pemberton used words to make him feel like he was the victim. He used the trans-panic defense, using words saying that he was repulsed, felt violated, that he was scammed, that Jennifer Laude was a fraud. Meanwhile, mainstream media at that time continued to vilify and demonize Jennifer Laude using her dead name, continuing to call her Mr., he, and him. All of these words to continue to violate a woman who was already dead. Why do I say, or why do I emphasize the words and the language that we're currently talking about right now, or the names and the titles and the words and the actions? I say this because almost all of the 200 Philippine languages essentially are gender neutral. Here's the one thing that is unusual about Filipino or Tagalog is that it's actually gender neutral. The 3/4 of the world's languages are completely gendered, like Spanish, French, etc. However, of those languages that are not gender neutral, like Tagalog and Filipino, they have a history of being gender coded. With that history, of course, comes gender violence. Here's an example of gender coding, and just to explain how different gender coding is from gendered language. A father and a son. Let me give you this riddle. A father and a son are in a horrible car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital just as he's about to go under the knife. The surgeon says, "I can't operate. That boy is my son." When this riddle first came out, I think in the 60s or 70s, people were bewildered because they couldn't understand how this riddle could possibly happen. It never occurred to people, and just saying, not a single one of these words right now are technically gendered. Not a single one of the words in this riddle are gendered. But for many people, they never really saw this a surgeon as a woman. Nowadays, there's actually two answers to this. The surgeon could be a woman, or the boy has two fathers. But it is interesting how the way we live and the society that we grew up in continues to think of a patriarchal bias or a heteronormative bias. I'm gonna add another thing when it comes to language and how language comes with it a history of violence. So I recently moved into my first apartment. I don't own it, but I am thinking about owning my first home. With that, I'm thinking about something called mortgage. Mortgage actually comes from a French word too, called morte and gage. Morte meaning, of course, death. Gage meaning pact. Essentially, when you sign your first mortgage, you're signing a death pact. Now, the funny part about mortgage is when mortgage was first invented, it was not invented for real estate. Mortgage was actually the means by which the slave trade was propagated in the US. It was basically the ledger to which black slaves were traded under. Thank you, by the way, what do you call this? To my friend Tatiana, who actually gave this talk that actually a reference for this. I just wanted to make sure that I give credit to Tatiana because she's amazing. What I'm saying here with these forms of languages is that we all have bias because our languages in itself came from systems that are biased, and we are born into those systems that are biased. But here's the thing. Those are the same systems that we design and that we can design. Oops. There we go. I'm going to introduce you to another person. This is Thais Estrada, a good friend of mine who is also an activist and an advocate and a trans woman. I call her my queer mom. simply because, as gay people, we get to choose our families. But yeah, this is Thais, very important friend of mine. A couple of years ago, I was doing my HIV research on the experience of HIV in the country. And I decided to send Thais the survey, which I was very ignorant on. And it started with a question about gender. I'm actually being very nice here in what I'm showing to you, because the original question that I wrote was, what is your sex assigned at birth? And this language, this small little fix of language, basically made Thais feel attacked at 9 a.m. in the morning, right as she was buying her coffee. It gave her gender dysphoria at 9 a.m., something that I did not foresee and did not know about in 2014. This is an example of how small little things can actually affect people, whether we intended for it or not. In this case, I, for one, had great intentions when I sent this survey to understand the user experience of HIV care in the Philippines, particularly trans women. However, no matter how good my intention is, my intent does not erase the impact that I create. Whether something is designed that way or not, whether something is designed at all, there will always be an impact. A design, whether it is designed or not, will always have an impact. Another great example of this is our favorite Miss Universe event, where I forgot his name, basically read out the wrong word. It was not his intent. Still, I think we can blame a lot on the card that he saw. But just to reiterate, no matter how good you try to design something, whether you intended it or not, it cannot erase impact. There's still a hurt, there's still violence created, and there is still violence that needs to be accountable for. Design that we, as designers, are accountable for. With that, because language in itself, no matter how well intended it is, will always have an impact because it is a system in itself. And with that, we have to remember that language is fluid. A lot of people don't realize that dictionaries are actually living documents and they change over time. Not a lot of people know this, that the Merriam-Webster dictionary actually gets updated every so often. Well, not often enough, but it does get updated. The problem is, because its updates so slow, we still have archaic definitions of racism. And we still have people in Silicon Valley thinking that you can be racist to white people. Well, no, you cannot. A good example of how language evolves over time is, we used to have this thing that people used to say a lot. Anybody who's actually studied Shakespeare will have heard of the word being used. Like, we used to use the word thou. And thou roughly translates to you. The thing is, thou used to be used for the second person singular. So when you'd say thou art, it means you are. It was particularly the second person singular, while you was made for specifically the third person singular / plural, actually. So it's funny how over time people just got basically lazy and we made you as both the second person singular and third person singular plural. That is how language actually evolves over time, and it changes all the time. So it makes me wonder why a lot of us can't seem to fathom how we can change UI in the same way, because UI is 80% typography and text. We can definitely make better choices around form fields. So instead of just having male, female, we can have, instead of male being first, female, male, or other, or prefer not to say. But that in itself is even a little bit conservative, just as gender, such as gender is a huge thing that actually has many facets, and just as language is constantly fluid and changing. Why can't we make user interfaces and design user interfaces that reflect this fluidity? Why not make it free? Why not make it actually a text field in itself? Why do we have to maintain a given array or a basic boolean when we can actually make it free text? It is not that important if you actually think if you think about it. And just as language is fluid, we can reclaim language that has become violent, or reclaim language and words that have become violent. To this day, I can now gladly tell you that the Babaylan, though they may mostly be extinct, their name lives on. UP Babaylan is now the largest student LGBTQI organization in the Philippines. So, though we may have lost the Babaylan to the Manananggal, we have reclaimed the title as right now one of the largest and largest forces in the Philippine queer activism. And when it comes to queer people losing their power, the Babaylan, which once was the pinnacle of the barangay, who lost its power during the Spanish era, we now have these, which as queer people are being more normalized, we start to have better conversations around bathrooms. I'm sharing this photo because I know it looks awkward and know it looks weird for a lot of you people. Why do we need to have an LGBT separate bathroom from female and male? Well, specifically, why do we have to have an LGBT bathroom slash Mayor Calais bathroom? Well, I'm glad to emphasize that though queer people lost much of their power during the Spanish era, we now have a mayor who is openly gay, walks around in wedge heels, smashing illegally modified mufflers in southern provinces. This is Mayor Calais, one of the fiercest damn mayors who walks around in heels, looking for people with illegally modified mufflers and basically smashes them with a sledgehammer. Props to her. And just so that we end on a good note, just as language changes and stories change, we can make great happy endings. I'm glad to tell you that Dinah did get her bike with the help of stories like the one that Lester shared about Dinah. She ended up getting her bike along with more than 60 of her Aita friends getting their own bikes so that they can actually help out their families, get some mobility, and actually find like proper access to different things. By the way, just to share, the words that she said when she got her bike, she said, "Parang himala, it feels like a miracle." That was just like, wow. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the, in the book and the movie Atonement, a girl named Bryony, who in her ignorant mind of a preteen creates a story that essentially makes her sister and her sister's lovers' lives a living hell for more than 40 years, from until their very deaths. To atone for this, she writes their stories in a novel that gives them a happy ending. Stories change people's lives, and those stories actually feed back into the society that we create. Stories that we as UX designers create with the designs that we create. These feed back into a society that either continues violence or actually reforms violence. A single word and a single button, a single text input, a single header can change people's lives for better or for worse. Now the question is for us designers, are we ready to write our atonement for the years that design has become violent? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mark.
Oh, I am done early.
All right, we're gonna bring Din also to the live cast.
Hello, hi. Wow, what an amazing talk, Mark. So many people reacting in the comments. I'm not sure if you see them here on StreamYard. Lots of claps, lots of applause. But we'll be having a session. We'll be in the sessions room later if people would like to continue the discussion. We've been monitoring the chat. No questions so far, but then the people who are here, please join Mark in the sessions tab here on Hopin, and yeah, you can
I'm
ask
trying
your
to
questions
figure out
there.
how do I get to the sessions tab. I'm trying to figure that out.
I'll message you in the private chat, Mark.
Yeah.
Like if
Right.
ever.
Very nice. Thank you so much for representing UX Philippines and Asia Pacific. I think you stunned the entire room. Everybody was um, reflecting on what you said. There were several points when you could almost mentally hear gasp around the room, realizing how powerful the message that you're bringing, Mark. And what I really like about that talk was it was also personal, and it's always amazing and illuminating when you hear a speaker speaks from his heart. Very well done.
Thank you so much. This definitely was a talk that was hard to conceptualize because it took me a couple of months to figure it out.
Yes. If you don't mind me asking, since we don't yet have a question, what inspired you to give this talk and to connect design to the legacy of our colonial history?
Well, hmm, where can I begin? Um, I guess for me, like number one, when I first got invited to this, I knew it was going to happen during Pride Month, and my queer identity is so integral to the way I design because it already emphasizes so much about what I live through. Um, and that in itself like already makes me like already I knew I wanted to talk through that or about that. Um, but another one is like I personally I am actually a very giant history buff. Like I am a nerd for these things, and um, it's one of those things where I was constantly looking at like old historians and looking at like I guess it's also because I was hanging out at Clubhouse way too much with all of these Filipino Americans who were trying to get in touch with their culture, and of course they were talking so much about their pre-colonial history, etc. And there was a lot of talk as well about Raya and the Last Dragon, which came out maybe 2 years ago, a year or 2 years ago. And it's funny because a lot of issues, a lot of people talk about how Raya and the Last Dragon was a failure, even though it showcased Southeast Asian culture so much. And they said it was a failure in the box office, and people were questioning was it because it was Southeast Asian? It was not very well known. And the reality is, do you people even realize that Southeast Asia does not have access to Disney Plus?
Yes.
Like the people who this film actually represents have no access to the media that represents them. Why do you think it failed? It was completely only released in Disney Plus, and it was actually an interesting film. No matter how slightly mediocre it was, I enjoyed like seeing like highlights of like culture that way, and that just made me want to take a look at where things were even further. But yeah, that was basically why I basically started thinking about how I can connect this to UX.
Yeah. So I think the what I'm continue hearing today is about being represented, feeling like you are being represented. um and that clearly has, it was quite a history lesson. The first 5 to 10 minutes of your talk, I learned so much about the culture of Philippines. In fact, where you have Manangal, in Malaysia we have Penangal, and I was googling that, and it was exactly the same kind of spirit. it fits on pregnant women. So I think the entire region of Southeast Asia, Nusantara itself, the way that you're describing it, it is so representative of the region. I have completely enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hello. We do have some questions in the Q&A, so I'll bring those to the stage here. One question was regarding gender fields. How do you reconcile the need to be inclusive, such as your suggestion to do an open text field, versus defining categories to make quantitative data analysis work at scale?
The thing is, I think the main question that we have to ask here is, why does gender not need to be a quantitative analysis in that sense? Also, even if we're looking at it at a quantitative analysis, even like if we use like, let's say, an open text field, we can use something like, let's say, a tag cloud or a word cloud to see how often certain things appear. From the most common ones, we can kind of see like what people generally call themselves and where does that lean to. That in itself is already data, and actually a little bit of quantitative data already as it is. There is mountains of ways to be inclusive with the what they call this, the limitations that we have when it comes to technology. I actually find that limitations like technology should make us more creative about being inclusive. Such as, again, like a text field, we can actually make it like, sure, it's a free text, but that can be like free text with tags that actually suggests to you what is most, what they call this, what gender identity kind of like denotes you best based on what you're typing. So you can actually create data analysis of this at scale.
Maybe it could be a scale or something similar. I have another question here that I'll bring up. What part of the pre-colonial history of Philippines do you bring to your profession? What do you think is sort of most important?
Okay, the funny part about this is I actually also have another talk talking about Dungeons and Dragons and how that relates to UX and how that relates to being a UX designer, where I say and I talk about how UX designers are not magicians. We are not mages. We are not paladins uh, that actually block everything, or like thieves who just like go in, etc. For UXers, we are storytellers. First and foremost, a big chunk of what we do is storytelling, and a big chunk of what we do is storytelling and understanding and seeking out stories. And the reality of it is never going to be that like giant sparky mage. It is more related to a bard. And the babaylan in itself is actually like part shaman, part bard, because the babaylan, and the reason why one of the saddest things about the downfall of the babaylan is they actually were the inheritors of the stories of pre-colonial Philippines. When they killed off the babaylan, they killed off our pre-colonial history. And those are the stories that we kind of have to reiterate. Now, for us UX designers, we have to constantly unearth those histories and those stories back again to understand who we're designing for. There's also, I mean, beyond the mere fact that I myself am a Filipino, and that in itself should constantly be something that I think about when I design.
We have another one, which said that even if you fall victim to gender non-neutrality, so in the survey example that you brought, what is a good thing to keep in mind for UX designers to keep this sort of, I guess, neutrality in mind continuously?
So even if you fall victim to gender non-neutrality, it's a good thing to keep in. Well, number one thing to keep in mind is you're always accountable. So I am not gonna go back and forth about cancel culture or whatever, because the reality is there's ways to mitigate harm, and one of the ways to mitigate harm is acknowledging that you actually caused harm. So even in those things, like let's say I fell victim into that, I caused harm. The first thing that I did was I retracted the entire survey and reworked it on it again for one day and then sent it out. there is nothing wrong with saying with knowing that you actually caused harm and knowing that you made a mistake and doing better at it. That's the one thing that I wish so many designers and so many tech companies understood. I am tired of non-apology statements coming out. It's just easier to just do better. And with that, like a major part of it is actually learning from that mistake, like learning so much from that mistake and just doing better. So up to now, I constantly watch myself and my fellow designers when they make these kinds of forums about understanding where or what we actually are asking for. Do we even need to ask for it? That's the big questions I ask of them. But yeah.
Very good. So if people are interested, I don't know if there's any more questions from anyone in the audience, then please do put it into the Q&A or the chat. I'm just looking through the chat if there's another question there. Yeah, there's also someone mentioning that different languages handle this inclusive language quite differently. So, for example, they mentioned Germany, where they append innen to include a feminine form to a masculine word, like mitarbeiterinnen, which is sort of employees, and sort of one part is written usually in italic and the other part in non-italic, so to show that hey, it's everyone. The French really go crazy because they include the masculine and feminine and the plural parts as well. So there's a lot of parentheses being used in verse to be really inclusive. So there is definitely some attention being paid to this, I think, in languages which are non-neutral, but sort of are making efforts to be inclusive. It is definitely not easy because that's not what those languages were made for. So these are quite a bit of hacks, I believe.
Yeah, but there is a growing movement around certain languages. Because I know there's a growing movement to make, to push. I think French. If I particularly know of French that there's a growing movement around linguists to make French less gendered. Because I actually because I studied Spanish and I have no idea how my table is female.
Yeah.
So like there are constant pushes for that, and I think it's a welcome treat because I know it's not going to happen overnight, but the importance is to understand that this is how things move. This is how things change, and we just have to work with it.
Yeah, I mean, to your point on in French, if there's all the women in the world plus one man, then that crowd needs to be referred to in the masculine. That's just a grammar rule.
Yes.
So, as you said, I mean, language is also something that's been designed. So I think that it's quite interesting. And in later on in 24 hours of UX today, we will have a couple of other talks that are touching on this topic. There will be one which is Every Word Matters, Inclusive Writing in the 21st Century. Then we will have another one which will focus on gender-neutral personas. I can't find the exact title, but that's the summary of it. So if you're interested in this topic, then there will be other things as well.